Days before securing my $20,000 house deposit, I knew my sister would make up drama to make my parents sabotage the transfer. It was a toxic pattern I could not ignore. So when they stole from me for her again, I left for good. 9 years later, my mother was standing in the red mud of my 150-acre commercial plant nursery in designer heels, loudly announcing to a real estate agent that she was selling my property. Welcome back to the channel, where ordinary people set hard boundaries and quietly come out ahead. If a story like this finds you today, you're exactly where you should be. Please subscribe to the channel so the next story reaches you too. My name is Marin. I am 34 years old. Right now, I own and operate the largest commercial landscaping supply and plant nursery in our side of the state. It takes a massive amount of physical labor to run a place like this. You have to be patient with the dirt, patient with the weather, and relentless with your own body. I spend my days maneuvering heavy machinery, hauling massive root balls of oak and maple trees, and managing a crew of 20 tough workers. I love the smell of the damp earth in the morning. I love the quiet reliability of things that grow when you put the work into them. But 9 years ago, I had absolutely nothing. I was 25 years old, driving a rusted-out pickup truck with a failing transmission, driving away from the only family I had ever known with a completely frozen heart. To understand the absolute, bone-deep satisfaction I felt watching my mother sink her $600 shoes into my wet gravel while trying to sell land she did not own, you have to understand the decades of quiet theft that led up to it. I was operating the front-end loader, moving a massive pile of topsoil, when I saw her sedan pull through the front gates. My mother, Althea, stepped out first. She looked exactly the same. Her hair was perfectly styled, her clothes immaculate, her posture projecting an unearned authority. She was pointing at my greenhouses, sweeping her hand across the horizon as if she had laid every brick and planted every seed herself. Behind her was a woman I did not recognize, carrying a leather folio, nodding along. My mother was giving a tour of my blood, my sweat, and my tears. I killed the engine on the loader. The sudden silence in the yard was heavy. I climbed down the metal steps, my boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. I pulled off my heavy leatherwork gloves. They used to belong to my grandfather, Silas. They were cracked and worn soft at the knuckles, and they fit my hands perfectly now. As I walked toward her, looking at the pristine manicure on her hands compared to the calluses on mine, I did not feel panic. I felt a cold, deep calm. I had studied stoicism for years to survive my childhood, learning that you cannot control the viciousness of others, only your absolute ironclad response to it. I watched her smile at the stranger, completely unaware that she was walking into a trap she had spent her entire life building. I knew I had the ultimate power in this situation, but the journey to get this power cost me my entire youth. How did a daughter end up watching her mother try to auction off her life from under her? My mother, Althea, ran our household through a very specific kind of psychological warfare. She used labels to divide and conquer. From the moment we were old enough to speak, she assigned my sister, Fallon, the role of the delicate, sensitive soul who needed constant protection. And I was labeled the strong one. I was the capable one. I was the child who could handle anything, which really just meant I was the child she never had to parent. For a long time, I thought being the strong one was a compliment. I thought it meant they respected me. It took me years of quiet observation to realize it was just their convenient excuse to abandon me. When you are the strong one, your achievements are invisible, but your utility is endless. My father, Alden, was a quiet, conflict-avoidant man who enabled every single thing my mother did. If she said the sky was green, he would compliment the shade. Let me walk you through the museum of my childhood pain, so you understand the exact foundation of this betrayal. Exhibit A was my high school graduation. I had worked incredibly hard to graduate at the top of my class. I was supposed to give a speech. But 2 hours before the ceremony, Fallon, who was 16 at the time, had a complete nervous breakdown because the dress she bought for a friend's party did not fit her right. She screamed, she hyperventilated, she locked herself in the bathroom. My parents spent the entire afternoon begging her to come out. They never showed up to my graduation. I stood on that stage looking at empty folding chairs. When I came home, my mother just sighed and said I always managed just fine on my own, but Fallon was fragile. Exhibit B was my college education. I wanted to study agricultural science. My parents told me there was no money for tuition, even though they had just bought Fallon a brand new car for her 18th birthday. They said Fallon needed reliable transportation because she was easily stressed by public transit. I got a job working the night shift at a massive warehouse, loading boxes until my back screamed, just to pay for my classes during the day. I was exhausted all the time. I was hollowed out. But I never complained, because complaining in that house just brought you a lecture on how ungrateful you were for upsetting the peace. My mother used money and favoritism to bind Fallon to her, ensuring Fallon would never be independent. She viewed my independence not as a success, but as an insult. I did not need her, which meant she could not control me, so she punished me by making sure I knew I did not matter. I asked her once, just once, why she never came to my college awards banquet. She was sitting at the kitchen table, polishing her expensive rings. She did not even look at me. She just said I was so resilient, Marin, and my sister was going absolutely through it with her boyfriend, so she could not split her attention. I absorbed that lesson deeply. I realized that if I wanted anything in this life, I would have to claw it out of the dirt with my own two bare hands. I told myself that once I reached a massive financial milestone, once I bought my own home, I would finally be free of their shadow. I believed that solid walls and a deed in my name would protect me from their chaos. I had absolutely no idea how far they would go to keep me at the bottom. By the time I was 25, I was working 70 hours a week. I had a full-time job at a large commercial farm, and I took private landscaping gigs on the weekends. I did not go out. I did not buy new clothes. I saved every single dollar I could scrape together. My goal was $20,000. That was exactly what I needed for a down payment on a small, run-down property on the edge of town that I wanted to fix up. It took me 3 years of brutal, mind-numbing labor to hit that number. When I saw the bank statement hit $20,000, I cried in my truck. It was the first time in my life I felt safe. The closing date for the house was set for a Friday. But earlier that week, my bank notified me of a sudden security freeze on my account due to a suspected fraudulent charge from a gas station. The bank teller told me it would take 5 to 7 business days to resolve and unfreeze the funds. I panicked. If I missed the closing on Friday, I would lose the house to a backup buyer. The only solution was to withdraw the money in a cashier's check immediately before the freeze locked everything down completely. I did it, but I had nowhere secure to keep that much money for 3 days. My rented room had a broken lock on the door. In a moment of pure, foolish desperation, I went to my parents. I asked if I could put the envelope in their heavy steel floor safe until Friday morning. My mother smiled warmly. She said of course I could, that family protects family. I watched her lock the envelope inside. I felt a massive wave of relief. That was the last time I ever trusted her. Friday morning, I drove to their house at 8 to get my money for the closing at 10. I walked into the kitchen. My mother was sitting at the table, calmly sipping a cup of herbal tea. Fallon was sitting next to her, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, but looking suspiciously dry-eyed. I asked my mother to open the safe. She took a slow sip of her tea, set the cup down, and folded her hands. She looked at me with this terrible, artificial sympathy. She told me the money was gone. My ears started ringing. I asked her what she meant. She told me Fallon was in a desperate crisis. Fallon had supposedly been scammed by a fake investment group online and owed a massive debt that was going to ruin her credit and send her to jail. My mother said she had to wire the $20,000 to the creditors the night before to save her sister's life. I stared at them. I demanded to see the legal notices. I demanded to see the wire transfer receipt. Fallon started wailing, hiding her face in her hands, saying I was being cruel to interrogate her when she was already traumatized. I grabbed Fallon's phone off the table. She screamed, but I was stronger. I unlocked it. There were no legal notices. There was no investment scam. I found her credit card statements in her email. Fallon had racked up $20,000 in luxury vacations, designer bags, and expensive dinners over the past 2 years, and the bank was threatening to sue her for the unpaid balance. My mother had stolen my house deposit, the literal sweat off my back, to pay off my sister's shopping addiction. I looked at my father, who had just walked into the room. I asked him how he could let this happen. He looked at the floor, shuffled his feet, and muttered that we had to keep the family together, and that money is just money. Money is just money. That sentence echoed in my head. It was not just money. It was 3 years of my life. It was my safety. It was my future. And they fed it to a bottomless pit of narcissism without a second thought. Have you ever felt your soul detached from your body? What would you do in that exact moment? People expect you to scream when your life is destroyed. They expect you to flip tables, to throw glass, to cry until you throw up. My mother was waiting for that. She had her victim face ready. She was prepared to tell me I was being hysterical, that I was the strong one and I would bounce back, that Fallon was delicate and would not have survived bankruptcy. But I did not give her the satisfaction. I remembered reading Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher, who wrote that the best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. Getting angry would just mean playing her game. It would validate her twisted belief that we were having a negotiation. We were not negotiating. We were finished. I looked at my mother. I did not blink. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, the silence stretching out, suffocating her. She tried to fill the void. She told me I could just save up again, that I was a hard worker, that the house was probably a bad investment anyway. I said exactly 3 words to her. I said, "Keep her then." I turned around and walked up the stairs to my old bedroom. I did not pack memories. I did not pack photographs. I packed 3 pairs of heavy canvas work pants, 5 thick cotton shirts, my steel-toed boots, and my winter coat. I shoved them into a faded canvas duffel bag. I walked back down the stairs. My father tried to put his hand on my shoulder as I passed him in the hallway. I did not even look at him. I just kept walking. I threw my keys to the front door onto the kitchen counter. They hit the granite with a sharp, metallic crack that made Fallon jump. I walked out the front door, got into my rusted-out truck, and turned the key. The engine sputtered and roared to life. I put it in drive and rolled down the driveway. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I did not shed a single tear. My phone started buzzing violently on the passenger seat 5 minutes later. It was my mother. Then my father. Then a barrage of texts from Fallon saying I was being dramatic and ruining the family dynamic. I pulled over to the shoulder of the highway. I took the phone, turned it completely off, popped the back cover, and removed the SIM card. I snapped the little piece of plastic in half and dropped it into my empty coffee cup. The silence in the truck after that was the heaviest, most beautiful thing I had ever experienced. It was the sound of complete, absolute isolation. The shock was keeping me numb, but beneath the numbness was a hard, brilliant clarity. They had stripped me down to nothing. But when you have absolutely nothing left to lose, you become incredibly dangerous to people who rely on your compliance. I drove for 6 hours straight. I only had a half tank of gas and $30 in my wallet. I drove away from the suburbs, deep into the rural agricultural county. I was heading to the only place on earth that asked nothing of me, owned by the only man in my bloodline who saw through my mother's absolute madness. Have you ever had to physically walk away from your own family to protect your sanity and your survival? Have you ever had to start over with just the clothes on your back? Tell me your story in the comments below, because I know I am not the only one who has had to make this terrible choice. I watched the landscape change from manicured lawns to rolling, overgrown fields. The sun was setting, casting long, dark shadows across the cracked asphalt. I was heading into a dead land, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I was finally breathing real air. I pulled up to the rusted iron gates of my grandfather Silas's property long after dark. It was a massive 150-acre plot that used to be a thriving tree farm decades ago. Now, it was a graveyard. The greenhouses had shattered glass. The irrigation pipes were cracked and exposed like bleached bones in the dirt. The fields were choked with aggressive, thorny weeds that stood 6 feet tall. Silas was 70 years old. He was a hard, bitter man to most people, but he was the only one who had never demanded I be strong for him. I knocked on the heavy wooden door of his farmhouse. He opened it, holding a mug of black coffee. He looked at my duffel bag, looked at my face, and did not ask a single question. He just opened the door wider and stepped aside. I sat at his worn kitchen table and told him everything. I told him about the $20,000. I told him about the fake crisis. I told him about the absolute emptiness in my father's eyes. Silas listened in silence. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking under his weathered skin. When I finished, he stood up, walked to the coat rack by the door, and pulled down a pair of heavy, cracked leather work gloves. He tossed them onto the table in front of me. He said the dirt does not care who your mother loves. He said the dirt only cares who bleeds for it. He told me I could stay in the spare room, but I was going to work. He could not run the land anymore, and he refused to sell it to developers, and he absolutely refused to leave it to my mother. He told me if I wanted to survive, I had to bring this dead land back to life. I put the gloves on. They were too big, slipping on my fingers. But I gripped my hands into fists and nodded. The first year almost killed me. I woke up at 4 in the morning every single day. The cold wind cut through my jacket like a razor. I used a machete to hack through acres of dense, woody brush. My hands blistered, burst, and bled into the leather of Silas's gloves. My back screamed in agony every time I swung a pickaxe to dig out the dead, rotted stumps of old trees. I was exhausted to the point of hallucinating. But I channeled every ounce of grief, every ounce of rage over that stolen $20,000 into the soil. I realized that my family had used my money to feed Fallon's fake, glamorous illusion. So I was going to do the exact opposite. I was going to use my bare hands to pull real, undeniable life out of the mud. Every time my muscles wanted to give out, I pictured my mother drinking tea while telling me my money was gone. I swung harder. I dug deeper. By the end of the first year, I had cleared 40 acres and repaired the main well. I fell asleep every night smelling like diesel fuel and pine sap. I was isolated, dirty, and broke. But my mind was incredibly quiet. The chaotic noise of my family's constant demands was completely gone. I was slowly becoming something entirely new. I was no longer the strong one taking the hits. I was the force of nature building a fortress. And my family, hundreds of miles away, had absolutely no idea what was growing in the dark. If you are enjoying this story of quiet, brutal resilience, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with the name of the city you are living in. Every comment helps spread this video to more viewers who might need to hear it. Thank you so much. The transformation was slow, agonizing, but undeniably real. By year 3, the dead land was breathing again. I had managed to patch miles of cracked PVC irrigation lines. I started small, propagating fast-growing native shrubs and hardy shade trees. I drove to neighboring counties, selling saplings out of the back of Silas's old truck to local landscapers. I poured every single penny of profit right back into the dirt. I did not take a salary. I lived off rice, beans, and the vegetables I grew behind the farmhouse. During this time, I found a 19-year-old girl named Blythe sleeping in her car down the road. She had a rough past and nowhere to go. I recognized the look of a discarded person in her eyes. I offered her a hot meal and a job pulling weeds. She turned out to be the hardest worker I had ever met, aside from myself. I trained her. I gave her a purpose. She became my right hand, fiercely loyal and incredibly sharp. By year 4, the numbers started moving at a dizzying pace. The first year, my gross revenue was a miserable $5,000. By the end of year 4, the nursery brought in $200,000 in commercial contracts. I had successfully pivoted from small retail sales to supplying massive municipal landscaping projects. The rusted-out graveyard was now a sprawling, highly organized commercial operation. We had rows upon rows of healthy, vibrant maples, oaks, and evergreens stretching as far as the eye could see. It was during this explosive growth that I met Hayes. He was a lead urban landscape architect for a major development firm in the city. He drove out to inspect our inventory for a massive park project. He stepped out of his clean truck, looked at my mud-stained boots, the grease on my face, and the sheer scale of the operation I was running. He did not talk down to me. He asked highly technical questions about root health and soil composition. We spent 4 hours walking the rows. He respected the work. He respected the science. And eventually, over months of negotiating contracts and sharing coffee on the tailgate of my truck, he respected me. Hayes became my largest client, my closest confidant, and eventually, the man I loved. He valued me for my mind and my endurance, which was a shocking contrast to a family that only valued my ability to endure their abuse. I was finally happy. I had a thriving business, a loyal crew, a man who saw my true worth, and a grandfather who watched me with quiet pride from the porch. But success leaves a trail. When you start winning state contracts, your name goes on public records. When you start buying heavy machinery, people talk. I had spent 4 years operating in the shadows, but the light was starting to catch the edges of my empire. In my mind, I was completely disconnected from the people who shared my last name. But predators have a terrifying ability to smell a fresh kill from miles away. While I was signing $50,000 invoices in my dusty office, my mother was hundreds of miles away, turning her attention back to the daughter she thought she had buried. How long do you think it takes for a toxic family to realize they made a mistake throwing you away? Because for mine, it took exactly until I became profitable. They were about to make their move. It happened in the 5th year. I was sitting in my office, going over payroll with Blythe, when my phone vibrated. It was a text message. I had changed my number years ago, but a distant cousin had tracked down my business contact info and mistakenly added my new number to an old family group chat. I had been completely silent in that chat for years, a ghost they had forgotten to exorcise. I opened the message. It was a text from my mother, Althea. She wrote, "Silas is getting very weak. The property up there is actually worth real money now because some idiot finally cleaned up the brush. When he passes, we will sell it and split the money 3 ways. I suppose we can let Marin keep a few potted plants if she behaves herself and does not cause a scene during the sale." I stared at the screen. My heart did not race. My hands did not shake. The absolute audacity of it was so astronomical it almost felt comical. I had spent 5 years breaking my back to turn a wasteland into a multi-million-dollar commercial asset, and she assumed I was just a free groundskeeper preparing her inheritance. She assumed she would just sweep in, hand me a houseplant, and pocket the millions I had grown from the dirt. Fallon replied to the group chat with a string of heart emojis, adding that she could really use her share of the money to put a down payment on a luxury condo downtown. My father replied with 2 words. He wrote, "Sounds fair. Sounds fair." I took a screenshot of the entire conversation. I did not reply. I did not type out an angry paragraph demanding respect. 99% of people would have blown up that group chat, screaming about the $20,000 they stole, screaming about the years of labor. But reacting is what victims do. I was a strategist. I walked out of my office, crossed the gravel yard, and went into the farmhouse. Silas was sitting in his armchair by the window, oxygen tubes resting on his face. His health had declined rapidly over the last few months. I walked over to him and silently handed him my phone with the screenshot on the screen. Silas read the messages. He read them twice. He did not get angry. He let out a low, raspy chuckle that turned into a dry cough. He handed the phone back to me. He looked out the window at the rows of perfect trees swaying in the wind. He said they are planning to rob a bank that does not have their money in it. He told me to go into the hallway closet, pull out the heavy iron floor safe hidden under the floorboards, and open it. The combination was my birthday. The real one, not the one my mother canceled for Fallon. I opened the safe. It smelled like dust and old paper. Inside was a thick manila folder. I brought it to him. What was inside that folder would change the trajectory of my entire life and set the stage for the most devastating, quiet revenge my family could never have anticipated. Do you know what a man does when he knows his own blood is completely rotten? Silas opened the folder and pulled out a stack of heavy legal documents. He tapped the paper with his thick, calloused finger. He told me he had seen this coming years ago. He knew the moment I started turning a profit, Althea would eventually smell the money. He knew she would try to use the courts to force a sale of the estate when he died, claiming I was just a tenant. So, 3 years prior, while I was out in the fields breaking my back, Silas had asked his lawyer, a sharp man named Thaddeus, to drive him down to the county courthouse. Right then and there, Silas executed an irrevocable transfer of deed. He signed over the entire 150-acre property, all the water rights, all the mineral rights, and every single structure on the land directly into my name. It was not a will. It was not a promise for the future. It was an immediate transfer. I looked at the county stamp on the bottom of the page in bright red ink. The land had been legally mine for 3 years, and I had absolutely no idea. I asked him why he kept it a secret. Silas looked at me with those hard, ancient eyes. He said I needed to build the empire like I had something to prove, and I needed to learn how to fight without a safety net. But most importantly, he said, we had to let Althea believe she was in control. We had to let her build her entire fantasy of wealth on an island that did not exist. When she finally stepped forward to claim the crown, she would step right off a cliff. He told me to put the folder back in the safe. He commanded me not to say a single word to my mother, my father, or my sister. Let them plot. Let them plan. Let them spend money in their heads that they would never touch. I locked the safe. I walked back out into the bright sunlight. I looked at the massive greenhouses, the rows of heavy machinery, the irrigation systems I had built with my own hands. It was all mine. The security I had craved when I saved that $20,000 was finally real, and it was entirely bulletproof. I went back to work. I bought 2 more heavy-duty loaders. I constructed 2 massive climate-controlled greenhouses worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. I hired more crew. I expanded the business exponentially. To the outside world, I was just a girl running her grandfather's farm. In reality, I was the sole proprietor of a commercial juggernaut. For more years passed in relative peace. I married Hayes in a small, quiet ceremony right in the middle of the oak nursery. Blythe was my maid of honor. Silas sat in his wheelchair in the front row, smiling. It was the only family event of my life where nobody threw a tantrum, nobody demanded attention, and nobody asked me to sacrifice my joy. Then, the inevitable happened. The winter was incredibly harsh, and Silas's lungs finally gave out. He passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 79. I grieved him deeply. He was the only true parent I ever had. But even through the grief, I knew the clock had started ticking. The moment the obituary hit the state registry, the vultures would circle. And they did. The worst day of my life had finally arrived, bringing the uninvited guests I had been expecting for 9 years. Are you ready to see what happens when narcissists think they have won? We held Silas's memorial service right on the grounds of the nursery, under a massive oak tree he had planted 50 years ago. Hundreds of people showed up. Local business owners, farmers, landscapers, and the crew. People respected him. And then, like a dark cloud rolling over the gravel driveway, my family arrived. Althea, Alden, and Fallon stepped out of a rented luxury SUV. They were dressed in immaculate black clothing, looking more like they were attending a high-society gala than a farmer's funeral. Althea immediately began performing. She dabbed her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, accepting condolences from people she had never met, acting the part of the devastated daughter. But I watched her eyes. They were not focused on the memorial. Her eyes were constantly scanning the property. She was looking at the massive new climate-controlled greenhouses. She was looking at the fleet of 6 heavy-duty commercial trucks parked by the barn. She was mentally calculating the value of the automated irrigation systems. Fallon was complaining loudly that the gravel was ruining the heels of her designer boots. She whined that the air smelled too much like fertilizer and asked if there was anywhere indoors with air conditioning where she could sit. My father just stood silently, trying to fade into the background. The contrast was sickening. While my crew, tough men and women in work boots and denim, stood in solemn, respectful silence, my blood relatives were treating the memorial like a real estate open house. After the pastor finished speaking, people gathered near the main barn for food and coffee. I was standing near Hayes and Blythe when I felt a hand grasp my arm tightly. It was my mother. She pulled me aside, her grip surprisingly strong. She leaned in, her perfume aggressively sweet. She smiled, but her eyes were completely dead. She said she was so glad I had kept the place relatively tidy. She whispered that she had already spoken to a commercial real estate broker. She estimated the land and the business assets were worth easily over $2 million. She patted my arm and told me to start packing my bags. The family was going to sell the estate by the end of the month. But because she was feeling generous, she said she would give me $10,000 out of the sale for my trouble, like a tip for a good maid. $10,000. She wanted to throw me $10,000 to leave the multi-million-dollar empire I built from nothing, to replace the $20,000 she stole from me 9 years ago. I did not scream. I did not flinch. I looked at her, noting how greed had aged her face beneath the expensive makeup. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. I smiled calmly and told her that sounded like a very serious plan. I told her she should absolutely bring her real estate broker to the nursery this coming Saturday morning, so we could sit down and formally discuss the transfer of assets in front of everyone. Her eyes lit up with arrogant triumph. She thought I was finally surrendering. She thought the strong one was just rolling over to take the hit, exactly like I had when I was 25. She promised she would be there at 10 in the morning sharp. She walked away, practically vibrating with excitement, whispering to Fallon that the money was secured. I watched them drive away, leaving dust in the air. I turned to Hayes and Blythe. I told them to arrange a massive barbecue for the staff and all our major clients for this Saturday. I wanted a crowd. I wanted witnesses. The stage was finally set for the execution. Saturday morning arrived with bright, harsh sunlight. The nursery yard was bustling. I had set up large tents, barbecue grills, and long tables. 20 of my toughest crew members were there, eating ribs and drinking sodas. Hayes was standing by my side. Thaddeus, Silas's lawyer, was sitting quietly at a picnic table, sipping iced tea, holding his scuffed leather briefcase on his lap. At exactly 10 o'clock, a pristine white luxury sedan crunched onto the gravel. Althea stepped out, wearing a sharp business suit. Alden and Fallon followed. And with them was a woman carrying a leather binder, looking very professional. This was Coraline, the high-end commercial real estate broker my mother had dragged into her delusion. Althea walked into the center of the yard, completely ignoring the fact that she was interrupting a staff appreciation event. She loved an audience. She clapped her hands together loudly to get everyone's attention. The crew stopped eating. The yard fell completely silent. Althea projected her voice, dripping with fake magnanimity. She announced, "Thank you all for working so hard for my father. As the heir to the Sinclair estate, my family has decided to formally liquidate this property. This is Coraline, our broker. We will be surveying the assets today. Do not worry, we will give you all glowing recommendations when the new owners inevitably bulldoze this place to build subdivisions." The crew stared at her. Some of them looked at me confused. Coraline the broker opened her binder, preparing to take notes. Althea turned to me, offering a condescending smile, and asked if I was ready to sign the preliminary consent forms to vacate the premises. I took a deep breath. The air smelled like pine and victory. I stepped forward. I did not shout. I kept my voice incredibly level, projecting clearly across the silent yard. I said, "Actually, Mother, you're not selling anything today. Or ever." Althea chuckled, a nervous, tight sound. She said I was being difficult, that grief was making me irrational, but the law was the law and the land belonged to the estate. I looked at Thaddeus. I gave him a single nod. Thaddeus stood up. He walked to the center of the yard. He clicked open the brass latches of his briefcase. He pulled out the heavy legal document with the red county stamp. He adjusted his glasses and spoke with the booming, absolute authority of a man who knows the law intimately. He announced that he was the executor of Silas's estate. He stated clearly, for everyone to hear, that there was absolutely no real estate in Silas's portfolio to inherit. He read the document aloud. He declared that 150 acres, all commercial structures, the inventory, the equipment, and the business entity itself had been legally transferred, fully and irrevocably, to Marin 4 years ago. Thaddeus lowered the paper. He looked directly at Althea and said, "You own nothing here. You have no legal standing here. Have a pleasant day." The silence that followed was not just quiet. It was a vacuum. It was the sound of absolute, catastrophic destruction occurring without a single drop of blood being spilled. I watched my mother's face. I watched the reality hit her. I swear, I could almost hear the sound of her greed shattering into a million pieces on the gravel right beneath her expensive shoes. Psychological shock is a fascinating thing to witness. My mother physically staggered backward. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking gray and incredibly old. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. She reached out and grabbed Alden's arm just to keep from falling over. Coraline, the real estate broker, was a professional. She instantly read the room, realized she had been dragged into a toxic family delusion, and immediately snapped her leather binder shut. She looked at Althea with utter disgust, muttered a sharp apology to me for the intrusion, turned on her heel, and marched straight back to her car. She drove away faster than she arrived. Then, the explosion happened. Fallon, realizing that her imaginary luxury condo had just evaporated into thin air, immediately resorted to her only weapon. She started shrieking. She collapsed to her knees in the dirt, ruining her expensive pants, sobbing hysterically. She pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed that I was a thief. She screamed that I was always jealous of her, that I manipulated a dying old man to steal her rightful inheritance. Not a single person moved to comfort her. My 20 crew members, hardened workers who had seen me bleed for this land for 9 years, looked at Fallon like she was a pathetic, raving lunatic. The manipulation tactic that had controlled my entire childhood was completely powerless in the real world. Althea finally found her voice. It was shrill, desperate, and ugly. She shrieked that she would sue me. She screamed that she would drag me through court until I was bankrupt, that she would prove Silas was mentally incompetent when he signed the deed. I walked slowly until I was standing 2 feet away from her. I looked down into her panicked eyes. I kept my voice cold as ice. I told her, 9 years ago, you stole $20,000 from my floor safe. You told me I was strong enough to survive it, and you used my money to feed your favorite child's delusions. I leaned in closer. I told her, you were right. I was strong enough. I survived it. I built a multi-million-dollar empire from the dirt, and it is entirely mine. And you are not getting a single, solitary cent of it. She physically recoiled as if I had struck her. She looked at Thaddeus, desperately searching for a loophole, but Thaddeus just shook his head and tapped the county seal on the paper. The paperwork was ironclad. There was no lawsuit that could touch me. She had spent 9 years planning to steal my kingdom, only to find out the gates were welded shut. I looked at my father, Alden. This was his final test. He looked at me, seeing the absolute power I held, seeing the undeniable proof of my mother's viciousness. For 1 split second, he looked ashamed. He took half a step toward me. But then Althea let out a ragged sob and grabbed his jacket. Alden stopped. He looked at the dirt. He put his arm around Althea, supporting her weight. He chose the familiar comfort of enabling her abuse over standing in the truth with me. He made his choice, and in doing so, he finally set me completely free. I felt the very last thread of obligation to him sever completely. I did not feel anger anymore. I felt an overwhelming sense of lightness. I turned my back on my father. I looked at Althea, whose face was streaked with ruined makeup, and Fallon, who was still kneeling in the mud, crying without a single real tear falling from her eyes. I raised my arm and pointed a callous finger directly toward the heavy iron gates at the entrance of the property, the gates I had personally repaired and painted. I projected my voice so every single person on the property could hear the final verdict. I commanded them to get off my land. I told them if they ever set foot on this property again, if they ever called my business, if they ever tried to contact me, I would have the police arrest them for criminal trespassing. Althea tried to speak, tried to summon one last manipulative phrase about family blood, but I cut her off sharply. I said, "We are not family. Family does not steal. Get out." They had no power left. They had no audience that believed them. They were completely stripped of their authority. Alden practically dragged Althea toward their luxury SUV. Fallon scrambled up from the mud, her clothes ruined, and ran after them, still sobbing dramatically. They got into the car. Alden threw it into reverse, tires spinning wildly in the gravel, desperate to escape the humiliation. They sped down the driveway and turned out onto the main road, disappearing from my life forever. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the sound of the engine fade away into the distance. The quiet returned. It was a beautiful, profound quiet. I felt a heavy hand land gently on my shoulder. It was Hayes. I turned around. Blythe was holding up a glass of cold beer. The crew erupted into cheers, clapping their hands and whistling. They did not know the whole history, but they knew a parasite had just been evicted from their home. I took the beer, raised it to the sky for Silas, and took a long drink. The air was clean. The land was safe. My soul was entirely my own. That was a year ago. My business has doubled in size since that day. We are opening a second nursery location next spring. Althea never filed a lawsuit. She knew it would cost money she did not have, to fight a battle she had already lost. Every few months, my office phone system intercepts a blocked voicemail from Fallon. She leaves rambling, tearful messages begging for a loan because her life is falling apart. I never listen past the first 5 seconds before hitting delete. Some branches are so rotten they have to be cut off entirely to save the tree. I built my life on the very thing they thought they could use to destroy me, my ability to survive hard work. They wanted me to be the strong one so I could carry their burdens. I used that strength to build walls they can never climb over. So, here is my question for you, the jury of the internet. My husband Hayes says I handled it perfectly. But some people might say refusing to even listen to Fallon's voicemails after a year is too cold, too ruthless for a sister. Tell me, do you think cutting them off completely is too cruel, or is it simply the required cost of protecting your own peace? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you have ever had to build your own family because your blood relatives failed you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening.